The Radnor uplands run west of Prestane in long, patient folds, and at the hour the shepherds call Sifnos, which is the Welsh word for the half-light between day and night. The wind on the moor does not so much move as arrive. It comes off the ling in slow pressures. It carries the smell of wet stone, and if you walk out onto the low rise, the maps call Sefenegger, and you stand still, and you let your weight settle through your boots into the peat, you will notice something the maps do not quite say. The ground beneath you, in one specific place, is hollow, not metaphorically. Structurally, beneath that low rise there is a stone-lined tunnel. It is 34 meters long. It is corbelled in dry stone, in the manner of a souterrain, and it runs in a direction that answers no known Iron Age purpose. Not storage, not refuge, not drainage. The tunnels exist. That is not in dispute. You can walk into the mouth of one of them today, duck your head under the lintel, and feel the temperature drop by a measured amount within the first 3 paces. What is in dispute is what the old keepers of that moor said about who made it, and why. For 100 years they refused to say it in daylight. In the spring, summer and autumn of 1894, a country curate at Llanfihangel Nant Milan wrote 3 elders' answers into a black cloth journal and sealed it under a promise. The promise was that the names would not be repeated whilst any of them lived. The journal was deposited at the National Library at Aberystwyth in 1912. It sat, misfiled, until 1994. That is the macro gap. That is the century in which nobody asked. The standard reading of the passage under Sefenegger is Iron Age, sub-Roman at the latest, a cold store or a hiding place. I am not going to attack that reading. The official story may be right about the century. It is not right about the reason. That is what the 1894 manuscript concerns, and that is the whole of what I am going to lay in front of you tonight. The elders had a phrase for the makers. They said it in Welsh, once each, and the curate wrote it down in Welsh, and then translated it in the margin in his sloping brown ink. The phrase was Ure, Bluog. The curate glossed it, in English, as the hairy ones. I am going to set that phrase down here and leave it. I am not going to explain it yet. The withholding is not a trick. It is the shape the elders themselves gave the memory, and it is the shape I intend to honor. They did not forget. They waited. They waited to be asked, and they waited for the ones who asked to be ready to hear it. If you are the kind of person who thinks 100-year silence is worth an hour of your attention, stay with me. Subscribe quietly. This channel is a slow one, and it keeps its promises. I am not going to tell you that the curate was right. I am going to tell you what he wrote, where he filed it, what the tunnels look like now, and what happened when a cataloguer named Mayor Ellis Hughes finally opened the file in the spring of 1994. That is all. The rest is convergence, and convergence is not proof. Read that again. The curate's full name was the Reverend Elias Pritchard Vaughan, and he held the curacy at Llanfihangel Nant Milan from 1878 until his death in 1911. He was Cambridge-trained. He was, more importantly, a native Welsh speaker, which meant that when he sat by a kitchen fire in a Radnor farmhouse, and an old woman shifted the kettle and began to talk, he did not need a translator, and she did not need to soften what she said into an outsider's English. He was an antiquarian correspondent of the Cambrian Archaeological Association. His letters to the association's secretary, dated 1891 and 1893, survive in the association's bound correspondence at the National Museum of Wales. In them he complains, in the polite code of a Victorian clergyman, that the cottagers of his parish will speak of the stones, but they will not speak of what the stones were laid over. He was not a sensationalist. He published nothing on this subject in his lifetime. His other notebooks, the ones on church silver and parish registers, and the tithe apportionment, are meticulous, dry, and correct. Nothing in them raises the temperature of the room. This is the man who wrote the black cloth journal. That matters. When a dry man writes down a wet thing, you look at it twice. The mechanism of the silence is worth pausing on, because it is not a mystery in itself. In the late 19th century Welsh marches, and in parts of the North Yorkshire moors, there was a documented ethnographic pattern by which certain things were not said, whilst any of them lives. The phrase means what it sounds like. Certain memories were not to be repeated to an outsider until the last member of a named group had passed. This is documented custom. I am not overstating it. It is the same mechanism by which some Hebridean walking songs were not sung outside the household, and by which certain West Highland death customs were kept from the schoolteacher until the schoolteacher had gone home for the summer. The curate specifically records that 3 elders, whom he names only by their farms, told him the same core sentence in slightly different words, on 3 different visits between April and October of 1894. The farms are to Isaf, Sef and Bryn, and Nantymosh. He does not name the people. He was keeping his promise. He gives us the roofs they slept under, and nothing more. 3 visits, 3 farms, 1 shape underneath. That is not the pattern of a single tall tale being repeated at market. That is the pattern of a preserved memory being handed over under condition. The manuscript itself is catalogued at the National Library at Aberystwyth as MS Welsh 14/C, under the title Notes on Prohibited Speech Among the Cottagers of the Radnor Uplands, 1894. It was deposited in 1912 by the curate's widow, with a covering letter, still on the file, asking that the loose sheets pinned to page 41 not be transcribed for publication in the lifetime of the parish. The pin, when the cataloguer lifted it in 1994, was still there, brown with age, holding the sheets exactly where the widow had left them. The black cloth of the binding had gone grey at the spine. The marbled end papers were still bright. The handwriting was small and sloping, and had turned from brown ink to sepia only at the edges of each stroke. On page 41, in the margin, the curate had written a single instruction, in his own hand, not to be repeated whilst any of them lives. Under it, in a different later hand in pencil, someone had written a date, 1978, and an initial, P. Somebody, in 1978, had checked whether the last of the elders had died, and left the note, and closed the book again, and walked out of the reading room, and did not, so far as any record shows, tell anyone what they had read. 16 more years passed before the file was pulled from its wrong shelf. The edges of what the elders said can be quoted here without breaking the shape of the withholding, because the curate quotes them at the edges himself. The old man at Tu Isaf, on the 2nd visit, in June, said that the makers of the passage were not our fathers, and they were not the fathers of our fathers. They were, he said, the ones who lived under the ling, and they went down when the sea came up. The old woman at Sephen Bryn, in the September visit, said only that they were hairier than the sheep, and taller than the door. She would not say it twice. The old man at Nanty Much, on the October visit, the last of the three, said that they did not go. They only went further down. 3 witnesses. 3 phrasings. 1 shape underneath. I cannot verify a word of that. Neither could the curate. He knew that. He wrote it down anyway, because his job, as he understood it, was custody, not verdict. But the passage under Kefni Ger is 34 meters long, dry stone corbelled, and runs in a direction that answers no known Iron Age purpose. The old man at Tuaisaf did not know that in 1894. The tunnels had not been surveyed. They would not be surveyed until 1957. That is where the edge of the story and the edge of the stone begin to touch. The cataloguer at Aberystwyth in the spring of 1994 was a senior manuscripts assistant named Mare Ellis Hughes. She was re-indexing the Welsh manuscripts backlog. The file had been on a wrong shelf, in the wrong sequence, for a long time. She pulled it. She read page 41. She read the pinned sheets on pages 42 through 47. And then, according to the internal record, she sat with it for a week before she wrote the memo. The memo exists. The memo is quiet. It says only that the material on folios 41 to 47 may be of interest to a serious ethnographer, and that it has been effectively unread since deposit. That is the sentence that opens the door. Now to what was on the pinned sheets. The name, first, delivered once, with weight. The elders said Uri Bluog. The curate glossed it the hairy ones. His margin is explicit on one point that most readers would miss. This is not, in his reading, an insult, nor a slur, nor a folk monster of the boggart or buka kind, the local mischief spirits that any Welsh child of the period would have grown up with. He writes, in the margin, that the tone was respectful, almost filial. The old woman at Sephen Bryn, he notes, crossed herself when she said it, in the older manner, thumb to forehead. That is not how a farmer speaks of a bogeyman. That is how a farmer speaks of an ancestor she is not sure she is allowed to claim. On the same folios, the elders described what the makers were said to have built. According to the curate's record, passages under the moors, many of them, joined. Standing stones set before the stones we know were set. A way of moving the earth, with the hand, not the ox. The old man at Nanty Mosh is quoted in one line the curate underlined twice. They did not build up, they built down. The old man at Tu Isaf added a detail the curate underlined twice as well. The makers, he said, kept warmth in the stone, in winter, without fire. These are recorded statements of oral tradition, taken down by a Welsh-speaking curate from 3 elders in 1894. They are not archaeological findings. I am not presenting them as archaeological findings. But the corbelled stone of a souterrain does, in fact, hold a stable temperature through a Radnor winter. Anyone who has stood inside one in January knows this. The old man at Tuisaf was describing a physical property of the tunnels his family had not entered in living memory. Their departure, in the elders' telling, was not a defeat. They were not driven out. They were not conquered. The phrase, repeated in nearly identical Welsh by 2 of the 3, was that they went down when the sea came up. The curate notes, honestly, that he cannot tell if the sea came up is a memory of a real event, or a way of saying, the world changed. He writes both possibilities in the margin. He does not choose. In 1894, the curate could not have known that the drowned forest at Borthainislas, 70 kilometers to the west on the Cardigan coast, had been exposed only the previous winter by the great storms of 1893. Stumps of Scots pine and oak, preserved in peat, dated later in the 20th century to the mid-Holocene sea rise. He could not have known that. But the elder's phrase, "the sea came up," sits beside the stumps as if it were written for them. That is not proof. Two things sitting next to each other are not by themselves proof of anything. What they are is convergence. Read that again. The prohibition, why the elders would not speak the phrase in daylight, is recorded on folio 45 in 3 voices. The old woman at Sephen Bryn said it is not for the tongue in company. The old man at Nanty Moch said they are still under. It is not for us to point at their roof. The old man at Tuizac said you do not name the ones who waited. That last phrase is the one the curate circled. The ones who waited. They did not forget. They waited. They waited to be asked. And they waited for the ones who asked to be ready to hear it. The physical description in the manuscript is thin, deliberately so, and I intend to honor the same restraint the curate honored. Taller than the door, hairier than the sheep, long-armed, slow-moving, not like us, and not unlike us. The curate himself refuses, in his own note, to speculate on species, on race, on anything of the kind. He says only that the description is consistent across 3 informants who did not, to his knowledge, discuss the matter among themselves. He will note the consistency. He will note nothing more. This is not a lost race claim. This is not an advanced ancestors claim. This is what 3 farmers told a curate in Welsh in 1894, under a promise of 100-year seal. That is all it is. That is also enough. The heart of the matter is what happens when you set that testimony beside the physical record and beside the other records, and see whether the shape holds. That is the work of the next section, and I will do it. Slowly. Begin with the tunnels themselves, revisited with what we now know. The 1957 Ordnance Survey memoir for the Radnor Forest Sheet, filed at Southampton, includes a single line in the fair copy on Sephen Gay. The corbelling technique, atypical for regional Iron Age assemblages. That is the whole sentence. No scandal. No footnote. Just an anomaly noted and left. The surveyor moved on to the next entry, which concerns a boundary bank. The line was never followed up. The direction of the passage is the second fact. It runs neither to a water source nor to a defensible outcrop. It runs, on the compass, roughly north-northeast, toward a point on the open moor where, in 1972, a doctoral student at the University of Aberystwyth ran a resistivity survey as part of an unpublished thesis on Radnor upland archaeology. Chapter 4 of that thesis, held in the university library, records a second, deeper anomaly, unexcavated to this day. The student never published. The thesis passed. The anomaly sits in the ground in a chapter no one has cited in 20 years. The old man at Nanty Moch in 1894 said the makers did not go. They only went further down. The 1972 resistivity data records a deeper chamber under the moor, in the direction the tunnel points. That is not coincidence. That is a signal. It is also possible the tunnel points that way because the dry stone builders followed a seam of workable clay. I am giving you the alternative. I am not hiding it, but the elder said the makers went further down, and under the moor, further down there is something the resistivity picked up. That is where the story and the ground meet. Move northeast now, into Shropshire, to the Great Peat Basin at Wixall Moss. Wixall Moss is a raised bog on the border of England and Wales. And in 1889, 5 years before the curate wrote, a drainage crew was cutting peat under the terms of an estate improvement on land held by the Hanmer family. In the estate daybook for that summer, catalogued at the Shropshire Archives as D593B214, there is a single line in a foreman's hand that records the find of the day. Human-like remains, dark, matted, of unusual proportion, reinterred at foreman's instruction. The remains were not photographed, they were not measured, they were not reported to the coroner. They were, in the foreman's phrase, put back where they came from. The estate daybook is real. The shelf mark is real. I am giving it to you so you can look at it. I am not asking you to accept the line as evidence. A single line in a 19th century estate daybook is not evidence of anything. Foremen exaggerate. Peat preserves oddly. Bodies pulled from bogs have looked strange to their finders since the earliest recorded examples. I concede all of that. But 5 years later, 70 miles south, in a language the Shropshire foreman probably did not read, a curate writes down 3 elders, describing the makers as hairier than the sheep and taller than the door. The drainage crew at the moss did not read the curate. The curate did not read the daybook. That is not coincidence. That is a signal. Move further north now, into Aberdeenshire, into a country that spoke a different language and worshipped in a different way, and buried its dead by a different rite. The Pictish symbol stones at Rhynie are not Welsh. I want to flag that shift, respectfully. These are the products of a people, the Picts, whose tradition is distinct, whose language is largely lost, and whose sculpture is one of the great puzzles of early medieval Britain. 2 of the Rhynie stones, catalogued in 1903 by John Romilly Allen and Joseph Anderson in the standard early Christian monuments of Scotland, bear carvings on the reverse that the compilers described only as possibly hunter figures, elongated humanoid figures, arms disproportionately long, hair or fur indicated by hatching that runs from shoulder to wrist and from thigh to ankle. The 1903 catalogue does not push the reading. It suggests hunters and moves on. Later, Pictish scholars have puzzled at the figures at intervals through the 20th century, and no consensus has settled. They are not iconographic of any known Pictish narrative. They stand on the reverse of the stones, on the side that faced the wall, or the earth, when the stone was set. The old woman at Cefn Bryn described the makers as long-armed. She had never seen a Pictish stone. She lived and died within 12 miles of the farm called Cefn Bryn on the Radnor uplands. The Rhynie reverses were carved by a people who lived and died in the northeast of Scotland. 600 kilometers away, 4 or 5 centuries before her grandmother's grandmother was born. 2 independent traditions, no channel of transmission, 1 shared physical detail. That is not coincidence. That is a signal. It is possible the Rhynie figures are stylized hunters, and the elongation is convention. I concede that. The convention would still have to be shared across a millennium and a border, and it would still have to match the detail an old woman in Radnor gave a curate under seal in 1894. Return now to the phrase when the sea came up. The drowned forest at Borthinislas, on the Cardigan coast, was exposed by the storms of the winter of 1893. Stumps of Scots pine, oak, birch, and alder, preserved in peat, standing where they grew. The subsequent 20th century radiocarbon work dated the death of the forest to the mid-Holocene, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years before present, when the western coastline of what is now Wales stood a kilometre further out into the Irish Sea, and the sea did in fact come up. That is ordinary sea-level science. It is not fringe. It sits in any coastal geomorphology textbook. The elders in 1894 said the makers went down when the sea came up. The forest at Borth exposed the previous winter shows a coastline that stood a kilometre further west, and a moment when the sea did, in fact, come up. The elders were not geologists. They had, so far as anyone knows, no measured knowledge of the mid-Holocene. That is not coincidence. That is a signal. They did not forget. They waited. The fourth physical anomaly is a holloway on the Long Mynd in southern Shropshire. A holloway is a sunken ancient track, worn below the level of the surrounding land by the passage of feet and hooves over centuries. The Long Mynd is threaded with them. The 1904 Ordnance Survey memoir for the church Stretton Sheet records one holloway that, in the surveyor's phrase, terminates in an unexplained blocked shaft, filled with dressed stone. The sentence occupies one line in its own paragraph. No excavation has ever been sanctioned. The shaft sits on land now held by the National Trust. The 1904 line has not been followed up in 120 years. The old man at Tuisaf said the makers built down and kept warmth in the stone. A dressed stone shaft, sealed and unexcavated, sits at the end of a track no one built for a purpose we can name. The tunnels exist. That is not in dispute. The shaft exists. That is not in dispute. The 1894 manuscript exists. That is not in dispute. What we do with the fact that they agree, that is the question this video is really about. Now widen the frame. In the summer of 1923, in the Sami village of Enontekiö, in the far north of Finland, a Finnish ethnographer named Uno Harva sat with a Sami tradition bearer named Aina Nilsdotter Portok, and took down, in a fieldwork notebook now held at the Finnish Literature Society archive in Helsinki, a series of phrases she gave him about the older layers of the country. Harva's work on Finno-Ugric religion is standard. His notebooks are consulted by every serious scholar in the field. In one of them, on a page dated to the second week of August, there is a single logged phrase attributed to the tradition bearer: Stalo under the peat. The Stalo in Sami tradition are a category of large, hairy, ambiguous beings, sometimes hostile, sometimes ancestral, whose stories are widely documented across the northern Sami cultural region and are treated with seriousness by Sami tradition bearers to this day. I am not conflating Stalo with the Welsh phrase. The traditions are distinct. The languages are unrelated. The peoples had no contact of any kind that we can document. But the shape of the memory repeats, large, hairy, associated with the ground beneath, with the peat, with a past that is not the present's past. Two custodial traditions, Welsh marches and northern Sapmi, separated by 2,000 kilometers and by wholly unrelated language families, both recorded by named ethnographers within 30 years of each other, both preserving a memory of large, hairy predecessors located beneath the ground or beneath the peat. I am not saying they describe the same thing. I am saying the shape of the memory repeats. That is worth noticing. That is a signal. Now the honest work. The reasonable alternatives to the pattern must be laid out openly, or the pattern means nothing. There are four I can see. First, cultural diffusion. Possible in principle, but the channel of transmission between an old woman in Radnor and a tradition bearer in Enontekiö is not visible in any record we have. Second, universal folk motif. Possible. Large, hairy beings appear in many traditions, and human pattern matching is a well-documented bias. Third, coincidence of two unrelated preservation instincts pointing at nothing real. Possible. Fourth, and most soberly, memory of a real archaic human or hominin population, distorted, preserved in the way oral tradition preserves things, accurately as to shape and unreliably as to detail. I do not know which of these is right. I want to be clear about that. This is not a video that ends with a hidden species being revealed. This is a video about what the elders said, and what happens to sit under the ground beside it. Return to the physical facts. The tunnels, the resistivity chamber, the dressed stone shaft on the Long Mynd, the peat bog line in the Hanmer estate, daybook, the drowned forest at Borth, the long-armed hatched figures on the reverse of the two Rhynie stones, the single phrase in the Helsinki notebook. 7 items, 7 independent sources, no one of them proves anything. All 7 of them laid next to a 100-year-old sealed manuscript from a Welsh curate, agree in shape. That is what convergence means. Not that any single item is a proof, that when you assemble them, and they all point the same way, the burden shifts, not to proof, to attention. Why nobody has done this before is not, in the end, a mystery. The pieces sit in 7 different archives, in 4 different countries, under 3 different cataloguing systems. The curate's manuscript was misfiled for 80 years. The estate daybook is a county archive line item that a researcher would only find by working through the daybooks of the Hanmer estate, summer by summer. The resistivity data is an unpublished doctoral thesis in a university library that has never been digitized. The Ordnance Survey memoirs are dry and single line. The Rhynie catalogue is a foundational text every Pictish scholar has read, but the reverses are not what those scholars are usually looking at. The Sami phrase is in Finnish in a notebook that was not written for outsiders. No one institution had a reason to pull them together. The cataloguer, in 1994, was the first person to hold one of the pieces and understand that it belonged to a larger arrangement. This video is the second time the arrangement has been laid out. That is not a boast. That is a description of the state of the record. If a serious ethnographer or a serious archaeologist decides to pull one thread of this, the archive is waiting for them. It has been waiting for 100 years. I want to add one thing about the cataloguer that has not been in the public record. In the internal memo she wrote in 1994, on the last line, she left a sentence that the National Library's latest summary of the file does not quote. She wrote that, on folio 47, at the very bottom, in the curate's hand, in a lighter ink, there was a further note, added later. The note reads, in translation from the Welsh, if this is ever read, it will be by someone who already suspects. The curate did not expect strangers. He expected inheritors. The cataloguer, in her memo, said only that the sentence was strange, and left it at that. She did not, in her working life, write publicly about what she had read. She retired from the National Library in 2011. She lives, so far as I have been able to confirm, quietly, in a village near the coast, and has not given an interview on the manuscript to anyone. Return now to the low rise on the Radnor Moor. The wind is still there. The hollow ground is still hollow. The mouth of the passage is still walkable, still 34 meters, still corbelled, still pointing. On the compass, at a resistivity anomaly the university has not been funded to excavate in 52 years. The black cloth journal is still at Aberystwyth, in a climate-controlled box. MS Welsh 14/C, folios 41 through 47. The pin now removed and archived separately in an acid-free envelope, filed at the back of the same box. The 1978 pencil note is still in the margin. The initial P has never been identified. The old man at Twy Saf died in the influenza winter of 1919. The old woman at Sefn Bryn died in 1927, of what her death certificate calls old age. The old man at Nanty Mosh, the last of the three, died in the winter of 1934, in the same farmhouse he had spoken from, 40 years earlier, in the presence of a curate who had ridden up the lane on a borrowed pony. The penciled note in the margin, 1978, P, was written by someone who wanted to confirm that the seal had lapsed. It had. It had lapsed for over 40 years by the time the cataloguer opened the file. Nobody had asked. They did not forget. They waited. They waited to be asked. And they waited for the ones who asked to be ready to hear it. The asking and the readiness arrived late. They arrived. That is what matters. I have not proved to you that there were hairy ones under the moors. I could not, and I would not. What I have shown you is a curate, 3 elders, a sealed manuscript, a cataloguer, 4 physical anomalies, 1 distant corroborator in a Helsinki notebook, and a shape of memory that repeats where it should not repeat. That is not proof. What it is convergence. Read that again. The tunnels are still there. The shaft on the Long Mynd is still sealed. The chamber under the moor is still unexcavated. The estate daybook is still on its shelf in Shrewsbury. The Sami phrase is still in the Helsinki notebook. The Rhynie stones are still standing in the churchyard at Rhynie. The reverses turned as they always were, towards whatever the carver thought they were addressed to. None of it has gone anywhere. It has only at last begun to be looked at together. The elders waited 100 years for someone to be ready. The ground has waited longer. Whatever is under the moor, memory, hominin, ancestor, story, or all 4 at once, is not going anywhere either. It waits. We are getting closer. We are not there. We are closer than we were in 1894, and closer than we were in 1994, and closer than we were an hour ago. That is all I can honestly tell you. The wind on Sefini Gair at Sifnos does not so much move as arrive. It comes off the ling in slow pressures. And under the boots of the walker, in one specific place, the ground is still hollow. That is not in dispute. That is enough for tonight.